Hi, Michaela.
Hello, Steve.
So today I'm going to be asking you some more viewer questions.
Great.
And the first theme, we actually had several questions on this theme, is to do with sex in long-term relationships. One example, how to go back to married sex life after 2 years of nothing. I miss the intimacy more than the sex. Another one, tools to remedy the roommate stage in a long-term relationship. And a third one, how do you build it into your relationship after 10 years? Get out of a long, dry spell.
Well, there's quite a few reasons why in long-term relationships that kind of question comes up and comes up for most people. And I'll list a few here, and then we can go into some details on and some tools as we go along. So in general, when people are in long-term relationships, other things take over from, let's say, the first flush of sexual enjoyment or the getting to know each other physically. And within that, there's an entire kind of course of engagement that has to take place for the relationship to solidify into something that's long-term sustainable. But that's quite shocking for most of us when that happens, because what makes relationship interesting and exciting, particularly in the beginning and throughout life, is that sexual erotic play, and is that kind of out of regular life engagement, and with it the intimacy and the connection and a closeness and the bonding and the feel-good hormones and all of those things. So it's typically for most people, and in many years where I would see one-on-one clients, that was the main complaint, was we are not sexually connected, or it's not good, or we're not doing it anymore, or things have gone somewhat strange, and then infidelity and insecurity and things like that. So it's a very, very big topic. The first thing to know, and we talk about it in workshops, but I think it's important to say it again and again because people forget about that. So the first thing to know is that what makes the sex exciting and interesting and that whole erotic play, even if the actual sex is not so good yet, because in the very, very beginning, it typically takes a bit till bodies get used to each other. But then there comes this wave of really interesting engagement where there's that flush of first excitement, and there are all the feel-good hormones, and there is this incredible erotic play of two people getting to know each other. And that phase is typically then considered the gold standard for what happens later in the relationship, which of course isn't feasible in many domains. But that's what we typically want, and that's also what we orient towards. And of course, that's also what we get to see in any movie or TV show or read in any book about that phase. And so there's a huge misconception that that's the way it's always supposed to be. And if it's no longer that way, then the relationship is essentially no longer good. What actually happens is that the sexual aspect of the relationship functions on a very different set of behaviors and patterns and biochemical processes than the getting to know each other and finding out if it's a long-term relationship. And so the easiest way to say that is that the relationship part is based on sameness. I always talk about birds of a feather stick together is the relationship aspect, and then opposites attract is the sexual aspect, the aspect that we sometimes call erotic friction, because it has that kind of two poles creating a spark. And within that, the more difference between the two people is, and the more newness there is, and the more excitement there is, the better the sexual arc of attraction, the better the sexual spark. And then, of course, for the relationship, the more we have in common, the better the long-term outcome will be. And when people meet, the first thing that typically happens is they find commonality. And that commonality gets them to talk about things. They both discover, I don't know, some obscure love for Japanese sea urchin or something like that. And it's like, oh, I like that too. Oh, I've been here too. So we discover these similarities, and that gets us going. Then we have that flush of newness that comes from opposites attract. And that makes for this really interesting, play where people talk all night and have great sex, and it's really exciting. And every time they brush up against each other, their whole body goes alive. And it's just this incredible moment in time. Then the more similarities are discovered and the more people do together, like for instance, now they have rituals, Sunday morning rituals together. They have common friends, they go places together, maybe then they move in. All of that brings them closer and closer and closer together. And therefore, there isn't as big of an arc of attraction. So with that said, eventually there comes that moment where the relationship is very aligned and people are kind of in that same groove and life makes sense and it feels really good. But people find themselves sitting on the sofa at night, sharing a bowl of popcorn in their matching sweatsuits, watching whatever is the newest show on TV. And it's really lovely, but it's not very erotic or exciting, and nobody really wants to have sex. So that's a fairly common thing to happen in a relationship. And when that happens, people think that they have a relationship problem, but they actually just have an erotic friction problem, meaning an attraction issue versus a relationship issue. So relational problems are problems that are based on there not being sameness. So that would be communication, ideas about values, money, religion, things of that nature. Those are relationship problems. Erotic friction problems, so to speak, come from having spent too much time being the same and not pulling apart enough, or not spending time away from each other enough, touching all the time, never giving the other person the space to kind of also be their own person. So that's typically what happens. And then as that happens, of course, the life that people build together also wears away the differences and wears away that excitement, because most of people's lives is logistics, right? So they have a house together, they have bills to pay together, they have jobs, then they have children, animals, all of those kind of things. Maybe they even work together. So the entire time together becomes this thing that I sometimes call administrivia. It's just, what do we do? Where do we do it? What needs to happen? And that's the death of the erotic. So that's one of the reasons why these things happen. The other reason why these things can happen is that people pull apart in the sustainability of the relationship because their goals and values are not aligned, and some kind of resentment builds. And that resentment then also influences their intimacy, because there is something there where the resentment of daily life makes it so that the body can't open to each other in that kind of erotic play, and there isn't trust, or there isn't a real willingness to turn towards someone. So that can also happen. And then once that happens, of course, and there's no longer body-to-body contact, and there's no longer that kind of a play, things can get pretty stark pretty quickly in the sex department. And so the first question was 2 years of no sex, when there could be all kinds of reasons, right? It typically starts with something like nobody feels like it. And then as time progresses, it becomes more and more difficult to go back there.
Oh, that's interesting. It seems you're categorizing some of the possible reasons why these dry spells might be occurring, where there might be a fading or a failing of sexual attraction, physical attraction in a long-term relationship. And you're discussing these two dynamics in relationship, That is the dynamic of a healthy relationship built on sameness and concordance, and the need for some kind of freshness, difference, perhaps even dissonance, for an erotic feeling or novelty, for an erotic feeling to naturally occur. That seems to be how you're laying that out. And so you said, well, it can be the case that the relationship is good, but that's where all the energy is, so to say. And so the dynamics of attraction aren't being tended to, and so they fail. And I think that's what the person was saying here, the roommate stage. This person was saying, no, it's going along really well, but best for friends, but there's no spark, so to say. So that's one category. You're also saying with this comment on resentment, it seems that it's possible also that the intimacy can fail because the relationship degrades to the point where the two people can't really turn towards each other in the way that's required for physical intimacy in relationship. I think there may be some other possibilities too. Two that come to my mind are health or stress challenges in life, periods of stress or difficulty, or outside of the relationship, or health challenges, physical, mental, and so on, in one or both partners. I think this can also be a category, perhaps, of interruption. Another previous traumas. This is often reported as something that's, I can go, and we got a lot of questions like that. I can go this far, but no further. We'll deal with that in a separate podcast. How to overcome trauma related to intimacy and begin to open up when one wants to. Another interesting category that we got several questions about was children. Having children and finding it then hard to, one question here, being a first-time mom, it can be very hard to get into the mood and relax. Best advice. And we had lots like that, since we've had children, interrupted things, we haven't been able to get back to it as well. So, I mean, I suppose I've listed there 5 possible categories. I don't know if you have any comments on any more of those categories. We're focusing now on this dynamic of good relationship, getting on well with each other versus, or differentiated from, hotness or the spark of physical intimacy.
Yeah. Well, I think it's worth pointing all of them out. And like you said, I mean, we've between the two of us come up with 5 categories. There's probably more, but also, of course, what happens is these categories mix and match in all different kinds of ways. And one of the things, and one of the reasons why we're looking more at the hotness versus relationship is because that's something that can be much more easily addressed because they're dynamics, right? So when somebody comes with this particular issue, it's of course always good to see if with a little bit of a change in the setup, the dynamics can be changed. But often once the dynamics have been changed, the other things show up, right? And I think it's important to mention this because in the first question is like, well, we haven't had sex in 2 years. Well, it just happens also that those 2 years have been extremely stressful pandemic years. And for a lot of people, and we hear this all the time, right, in workshops now, that for a lot of people, now that there's kind of a tail end where the acute phase of the pandemic has passed, now people get to actually see all the cracks that have appeared, and they can feel all the traumas or injuries or stressors that have piled up. And it's an odd moment in time because for a lot of people, they kind of feel like they should just go back into their lives and things should be back to normal. But there's this backlog of all of the things you talked about, maybe having still some fatigue from having had COVID, right? Maybe having, not been away from one's partner for years, working from home, raising children from home, maybe even having parents. I spoke with somebody yesterday, the parents moved in at the beginning of the pandemic. They haven't had a moment to themselves. The bedrooms are next to each other. They were newly married. And, they have to have very, very quiet sex because it's just so weird being an adult and having the parents of the husband next door, right? So there's all of those things that all kind of make it such that a lot of people don't have a lot of sex. And like you were saying, health and also exhaustion are definitely things to not look at lightly. One of the interesting things about sex and sexual desire and sexual engagement is that we are somehow all believing still, and I think this comes, it's partly folklore and partly also how people feel in their teens and 20s. We're somehow led to believe that somebody always wants to have sex, and meaning it should be super easy to just get it on spontaneously. It's a sign of love or a sign of desire that one of the partners kind of always feels like. It doesn't have to be at the same time, but there's this enticement and somebody wants to do it and then it just happens. And yeah, that's of course true when you don't have a lot going on. You can have a quickie on the kitchen table or something. You don't do that with two children and the parents in the house, or two children and a Zoom call 5 minutes from now, or things of that nature. So that whole myth of sex being the spontaneous thing that just happens regardless of people's health, well-being, stress levels, and the same with after birth, right? When did it become the norm? And this of course is something we see a lot on social media, but even before then there were people who would just pretend that having a baby, is just a thing that you do and then you just go back to your regular life. I remember I used to have a client. She had her hairdresser and her makeup artist come to the hospital after delivery of her first child, so that for the photos of the first child with her husband, she'd look good. And that, of course, is a myth, because it's an innately messy, doesn't mean you have to let yourself go forever or accept horrible circumstances, but that extra pressure to be perfect and sexy and have sex immediately again after you've healed up, or regardless of how much sleep you get, and regardless of the fact that you're breastfeeding, or those are big stressors, and they will make the natural, easy sex drive go down.
That's very interesting. One of the points you made earlier on there was that when answering this question in a general way, of course, we're working with a couple, you can be very, very specific, but working in a general way, you like to address that first layer of relational dynamics, behaviors, routines, habits, etc., that might be quenching the possibility of erotic connection, and arranging that in such a way that, well, now there's maybe a chance. And you've also said that when you do that at that somewhat superficial level, sometimes that fixes it, other times that reveals layers beneath of reason, which fall generally into the other kind of categories we've been talking about. So perhaps to end this particular podcast, we'll come back to those other deeper reasons in future episodes. I'm wondering if you could give 2 or 3 tips, I suppose, on how to arrange those dynamics. I know you often talk about touch, spending time apart, and time, not mixing time, logistical time with intimate time and so on. So I don't know if you might want to make some comments on those particular pieces of advice.
Yeah, so the big dynamics here, to give some very practical things that anybody can try at home. And I think the biggest of the big dynamics is to spend time apart. It's very, very important that the bodies are not together all the time, every day, all day. It really kind of desensitizes people to each other when they're constantly in the same space. You barely take any notice of that person if they're constantly there, and even worse if they're constantly rubbing up against you and touching you. That's really not good for the nervous system to create that separation that creates the attraction. So having time apart, and that can be as simple as maybe working in separate rooms when both people work at home, right, and not constantly seeing each other. Having some time away from each other in a way that's rejuvenating and regenerative. And that might be being out with friends, or being out in nature, or even taking some time away from each other for a weekend apart. Those are super important things. The more that can be done, some people take that to the extremes of they have separate bedrooms and only come together when they are somewhat rejuvenated and they feel like it, but not everybody has the space or the willingness to do that. But at least before you want to engage a much more intimate time together, spend some time apart. The next thing, of course, is when two heads meet at the end of the day, meaning you've been thinking all day and doing, then the bodies aren't really open to the engagement and there isn't a lot of willingness. There might be tiredness or even just numbness from having spent so much time in the head, that it's really important to come back to the bodies. And coming back to the bodies once again could be taking a walk, doing some yoga, having a bath, dancing around, putting some music on, doing a simple foot massage, rolling on the grass with the puppy or something like that. Anything that brings the body back online. And then the other thing, of course, is that for most people, spontaneous sex isn't really an option anymore for all kinds of reasons. So while that in the beginning feels just like such a horrible chore, scheduling time for intimate connection is super important. Now, I would always suggest that you don't schedule time for sex because that's a lot of pressure. But spending time where it's just the two people doing things and speaking about things and having time together as two people who like to have sex is super important. And that brings us to maybe the single most important aspect, which is when people get to do that, sometimes called a date night discipline. When people do that, then you have to discipline yourself to not bring the entire administrivia back into that moment of the date. Even if the date isn't necessarily sexual to begin with, but you're sitting somewhere at a nice dinner or you're sitting out having a picnic watching the sunset, you have to have the discipline not to load up all the things that need to be done and not to talk about what the dog did at the vet this morning and which bill needs to be paid and who picks up the kid tomorrow morning. You'll have to come up with something else to talk about, and ideally something that makes you interesting to the partner.
Well, thanks, Michaela. That was very fascinating and very useful indeed.
Thank you.